Shalom Aleichem, welcome. I'm Lisa Newman, the Yiddish Book Center's Director of Publishing and Public Programs. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program, to the Yiddish Book Center's virtual theater for There and Back Again, Jacob Glatstein's Voyage Home with Ezra Glinter. Before we get started, the usual cautions. Your video and audio will be off throughout the show, and we ask that you send questions via the question panel at the lower right of the screen. Please keep questions short, and we ask that you refrain from comments so that we can try to get to all of the questions this evening. I am delighted to introduce this evening's presenter and colleague, Ezra Glinter. Ezra is the Yiddish Book Center's senior staff writer and editor. He's an award-winning writer, editor, translator, and biographer. Born and raised in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Ezra attended McGill University and New York University, where he received a master's degree from the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute, and for 5 years he worked as the deputy culture editor of the Forward newspaper, where he edited Have I Got a Story for You?, a landmark anthology of writing of Yiddish fiction in translation. In addition to the Forward, Ezra's writing has appeared in the New Republic, the Boston Globe, the Los Angeles Times, the Paris Review, the Walrus Magazine, and National Post, among other publications, and he's a frequent contributor to Pockenträger. He's currently writing a biography of the 7th Lubavitcher Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, for Yale University Press. Welcome, Ezra.
Thank you, Lisa.
Great to see you.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm talking this evening about Jacob Glatstein, or Jacob Glatstein. We'll get to that distinction in a minute. But I'm talking about him and his book that we're reading here at the Yiddish Book Center as part of our Great Jewish Books Club, which many of you are reading, the Glatstein Chronicles. It is, many of you know this, I don't have to tell you, but it is a great book. Those of us who are involved with Yiddish, who are involved with Yiddish literature, we're often preaching the gospel, how great Yiddish literature is. And it is, but, like any literature, some of it is great, some of it is less great. This book is one of those where really you pick it up, you open it, you start reading, and you realize, wow, this is good. So I encourage you all, if you're not already reading it, to get a hold of a copy and give it a go. It's really worth it. Of course, I have to give right off the bat credit to the translators and the editor of the volume. It is in 2 parts, and it is translated by Meir Deschel and Norbert Guterman, and it is edited by Ruth Wise, whom I will be referring to also because her comments and her commentary on this book and on Glatstein are extremely valuable. So in addition to the inherent qualities of this book, which are, of course, mostly due to Glatstein, the translation itself is quite remarkable. And you can see in reading it that the translators have made some really interesting choices, some really smart choices. And I'm not going to go through all the intricacies of the translation this evening. It really is kind of a masterclass in translation as well. There's a couple other things I'd like to say before I really get going. One is to acknowledge and confess that I myself personally am not the world's greatest expert on Jacob Glatstein. That's just a fact. I am an enthusiast though, and I've been reading Glatstein and thinking about Glatstein for a little while now, and I hope to share some of those thoughts and some of that enthusiasm with you, and to hear your thoughts in return, as befits a book club event. But there may be things that I don't know or questions that I can't answer. So just to sort of forewarn you about that, there are greater experts out there than I am. And also to sort of try to resolve this difficulty about what exactly his name is, or what we call him. In English, we generally refer to him or spell his name as Jacob Glatstein. That is what's on the cover of this book. That's what's in the title of this evening's presentation. And I think referring to him that way in English is fair because it was his English name. He lived for most of his life in the United States. I'll get into more of his biography soon. but he lived for a long time in the US and he had an English name, and it was Jacob Glatstein, presumably. It may not have actually been his legal name. I'm not entirely sure what the whole story is here, but it's possible that his legal last name is actually the more waspy sounding Gladstone. He does have descendants with the last name Gladstone. Nonetheless, in English, he is generally referred to as Jacob Glatstein. I think that's fine in an English context. However, I feel it's also kind of awkward to refer to him that way, especially when discussing. I mean, he is a Yiddish poet, and his peers, his colleagues, his audience, his readers would have thought of him more as Jacob Glatstein. So I will probably be using those names interchangeably throughout this talk, although more often probably using Glatstein than Glatstein. Nonetheless, I think you'll know who I'm talking about. So to get really into the topic of this evening's presentation, the title is There and Back Again, Jacob Glatstein's Voyage Home. Now, if that title rings a bell or sounds familiar to any of you, that might be because I stole it from J.R.R. Tolkien. It's actually There and Back Again is actually the subtitle of The Hobbit. I did that because it occurred to me and I thought it was cute. I didn't really intend it to have any real deep meaning. But on thinking about it further, I realized that there is actually a kind of connection there and a kind of parallel between what's going on in this book and what's going on in Glatstein's life and career surrounding this book and J.R.'s Tolkien's children's book, The Hobbit. Incidentally, The Hobbit was written and published at just about the same time as the Glatstein Chronicles. The first part of the Glatstein Chronicles came out in 1938. The second was published in 1940. Tolkien wrote The Hobbit and published it in 1937. So they're really contemporaneous. But also the plot of The Hobbit is about the Hobbit Bilbo Baggins, who goes off on this grand adventure with a bunch of dwarves to the literal dragon's lair. And when he comes back, he's forever changed. He's not the innocent character he once was. He's seen things, he's done things, he's been altered by the gravity of his experience and what he has witnessed. Now, obviously, that's a fantasy story. What we're talking about tonight is not, but the thesis is somewhat similar. And this is not a new idea. This is not a particularly original idea to me at all. But I think it's true that this book, both the trip that Glatstein took, which became the subject of the book, as well as the writing and publishing of this book, became a kind of turning point in his life and more importantly, in his creative career as a Yiddish poet and as a Yiddish writer. It did take place chronologically almost exactly at the midpoint of his life. And it really sort of forms a kind of almost a hinge or a fulcrum between one half of his life and career and the other. And I don't want to get too carried away with this idea. I don't want to make excessive claims. There's a lot of continuity between the earlier part of his career and the later part of his career. It's not like was ever any kind of clean break. But nonetheless, I think it's true that beforehand, you could see in Glatstein's work that he was a consummate modernist. He espoused this kind of aspirational, optimistic universalism in his writing and in his poetry. And afterwards, he tended more towards a more particularistic point of view, having to do with the Jewish people, with the Yiddish language. And of course, after the Holocaust, a much more elegiac point of view, a more backwards or, a view of commemoration of what was lost, perhaps inevitably. To take a step back, though, first, let's talk about who Jacob Glatstein was. There are, in fact, not a lot of great biographical resources out there, despite the fact that he was one of the 20th century's greatest Yiddish writers. There is a long entry on him in the Lexikon von der Neuen Yiddischer Literatur, which is the biographical dictionary of modern Yiddish literature. That's where most of the following information comes from. And it's also possible, it's arguably possible to take biographical information from this book, the Glatstein Chronicles, which contains a lot of memoiristic and autobiographical type of material. Now, doing that might be a little risky or a little controversial because it's not exactly an autobiography. It's not exactly a memoir. It is fictionalized. So, how do we know in any particular case what is real, what is, perhaps exaggerated or elaborated or invented for the sake of the fiction or for literary purposes? So we're not on the most solid ground when we start taking biographical material from this book. Nonetheless, as Ruth Wise has pointed out, there is really there's no biographical fact from Glatstein's life that contradicts anything that we read in the book. Everything lines up pretty much exactly. Everything is accurate as far as we can tell. So that is also a source. Glatstein was born in 1896 on August 10th in Lublin, which was then and is now mid-sized Polish city. I think today it's the 9th largest city in Poland, so it's not huge. I don't know exactly what its population is now, but then when Glatstein was born, right around the turn of the 20th century, it had a population of 50,000 people, about half of whom were Jews. So it was not a tiny place, but also not a huge place, and it was a very Jewish place. At that time, it was part of the Russian Empire. It was part of Congress Poland, which was the Russian Empire, and the Pale of Settlement, which was part of the empire where Jews were allowed to live. After the First World War, it became part of the Second Polish Republic, but by then, Glatstein wasn't living there anymore. And it was home to this, very ancient and storied Jewish community as well. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard of the Vad Arba Aratzos, the Council of the Four Lands, which was this pan-Eastern European Jewish body that existed at the time of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It was, long defunct by the time Glatstein came around, but nonetheless, its seat was in Lublin. It had this long and storied history as far as this Jews and Jewish community went. Glatstein's family background is fairly interesting. He came from what seems to be like a sort of traditional religious background. That seems to be the way he describes it in the Glatstein Chronicles. But it was not Hasidic, which would have been not unusual in that part of Poland. And his family was given to certain modern types of activities and interests. They were attracted by the Jewish Enlightenment movement. His father was a big fan of Yiddish literature. He had an uncle and cousins who were singers or musicians. His uncle was a cantor. And so he came from a background that was on the one hand fairly traditional, but also fairly cultural and worldly. He himself received a religious education well into his teenage years, until about the age of 16 or so, until shortly before he left Poland for America. So that was fairly intense, fairly comprehensive. And he received other kinds of instruction on the side from tutors. He described some of them in the second part of the Glatstein Chronicles. Individual tutors in language and other subjects that he didn't study at school. And he and his group of friends were also very literary minded. In another scene, he talks about all the writing they were doing. How one of them was this poet that everybody else envied because they thought he was just the greatest poet of them all. How they would go around with these books of literary criticism. So it was really a very worldly and intellectual milieu. Around 1913, he took a trip to Warsaw with one of his uncles. where he went periodically, and he made a pilgrimage, sort of the requisite pilgrimage to go visit Isle Paris in Warsaw. And he met some other of the major Yiddish writers at that time. And he was apparently writing even then. He apparently had submitted a story that was going to be published in one of Warsaw's Yiddish newspapers, and for some reason or another, it wasn't. The circumstances are not exactly clear, but the point is that he was writing even as a teenager. But things in Poland were not good for Jews. I mean, there's not too many times in history you could say they were great, but at this time they were particularly bad. Especially economically, because there were anti-Jewish boycotts. There were quotas and restrictions against Jews in higher education and universities and in the professions. So there's really not a lot of future for a bright young Jewish kid. So he got sent to America, where he joined another one of his uncles, his father's youngest brother, I believe. He left in the late spring of 1914. So really kind of fortuitous timing. It was just a few months before the beginning of the First World War, and it was also just a few months before his own 18th birthday. And for the first few years in the U.S., he lived the life of a newly arrived immigrant, a greenhorn. It wasn't fun. He described some of that in this book, some of the weird jobs that he did that weren't particularly pleasant. He worked in sweatshops. He learned English. He struggled to get by. And finally, about 4 years later, in 1918, he had learned enough English. He had progressed far enough that he made it into law school at New York University. You would think that would have been like the greatest stroke of luck, right? He had made it, and as hard as life might have been for newly arrived Jewish immigrants in the United States, in New York, there's always better and then worse. You see in this book where throughout the whole thing, he kind of has, or the narrator of this book kind of has, a very privileged status compared to many of the people he meets, because he's an American. Because he can always, he's going back, he's going home, he's not stuck in Poland like most of them are. So even if he was struggling at the beginning, he was still in a better circumstance than he would have been if he had stayed. But even though he had seemingly made it, or at least was on the road to making it, by getting into law school and going to law school, he decided pretty quickly that law school was not for him, being a lawyer was not for him, and he dropped out. Now, he'd been writing more or less since he had arrived and beforehand, but sort of sporadically, intermittently. I'm sure he was struggling to make a living. He didn't have all that much time to write, but he had published a few things, a few stories here and there in the Yiddish press. There's actually in the last talk I gave, if any of you saw that, somebody asked the question about women's representation in the Yiddish press, whether there were a lot of women who wrote for the Yiddish press, and what the attitude was of the Yiddish press towards women. And I said that one of the things I said was that the Yiddish press actually valued women's contributions because they believed that it would help newspapers appeal to women readers. And this is sort of borne out by Glatstein's experience. He started sending poetry to an anarchist newspaper called Freie Arbeiterstimme, or the Free Voice of Labor. And the editor there was not a huge fan of his poems and didn't really want to publish them. So Glatstein started sending them in under the pseudonym Clara Bloom, at which point the editor decided actually that he was going to publish them. And then, of course, finding out that Clara Bloom was really Uncle Glatstein, he stopped publishing him again. But he had more success getting published as ostensibly pretending to be a woman than under his real identity. But it was only around 1919, after, or while in the process of leaving law school, that he really started writing again, where he really started writing poetry again, where he really got serious about his literary future, his literary career. He met someone named Menachem Minkoff. If I got his name right. Anyways, and together with another poet named Aaron Glatstein, they started a movement called the Inzichisten, loosely translated as the introspectivists, which was a modernist movement of Yiddish poets. They weren't the first. They had been preceded in New York by another modernist literary movement called the Junge, with whom they really shared a lot. They weren't that distinct from each other, but except they were of different generations. But they were both reacting against a kind of a previous mode of poetry, the sweatshop poets and so forth, that was very topical, that was very structured, and very in terms of meter, in terms of rhyme, all the structuring elements of poetry. They took the typical modernist stance, is that we don't want all this, we don't need all this. It's better for a poem to find its own rhythm. It's better for it to find its own voice. So they advocated for free verse, without set stanza structures or metrical structures or rhyme schemes, and they advocated for a subjective viewpoint. So the poetry didn't necessarily have to be about topical subjects. It could be about anything that concerned the poet. And this was in a way keeping with a lot of modernist literature generally, but it also had special meaning for Yiddish, because they were claiming for Yiddish the right to exist as a literary language just like any other, that it could concern itself with any subject. It didn't have to be about Jewish subjects. It didn't have to be about it didn't have to be about Jews. It didn't have to be about subjects that were relevant to the Jewish community. It could be about anything the poet wanted to write about. And so that was fairly groundbreaking in its time. And so Glatstein really became one of the stars of this scene in the 1920s and 30s. He published his first book, self-titled, Jacob Glatstein, in 1921. And one of the interesting things I think about him and about his poetry is that he was influenced by not only by European modernists or writers, Russian and German writers, as a lot of Yiddish writers were. They read Russian literature, they read German literature, they read the national literatures of, say, Poland. But Glatstein also read like English language modernist literature. He also read, he read Joyce, he read T.S. Eliot, and I think you can see those influences on occasion. So he achieved some success. Of course, he didn't make his living writing poetry. Even then, that was a very difficult proposition. He did what most Yiddish writers did, and they made a living writing journalism, writing for the Yiddish press. And throughout his life, from then on, he had a very long and successful career writing mainly, political commentary or commentary on current events and literary criticism for the Yiddish press. And there's a lot. I'm going to get back to this, but there's a lot of material that he wrote and that's been published in different ways, in different forms, of other nonfiction, of literary criticism that nobody has really yet paid a lot of attention to. So I wanted to illustrate kind of some of the things I've been talking about here, which to this point are kind of abstract. But to make them a bit real, I want to read one of Glatstein's poems. What I'm going to do though here is let him read it first. We can actually listen to him read it. This is a recording from 1955. It's part of our collection of recordings from the the Yiddish Book Center's collection of recordings from the Montreal Jewish Public Library that are digitized and are all on our website. So we have a number of them with Glatstein, and here he is in 1955 reading a poem that I believe was published in 1929 called Sing Ladino or Sing Ladino, and it's going to be in Yiddish. It's not a long poem, but it's going to be in Yiddish at first. But even if you don't understand the words, just listen to how it sounds. It is really remarkable.
Sing Ladino. Sing Ladino, blonder Sänger, unser Zeuger Jargonino, alkoholierte Rederei, altzezunkte Spracherei, zum Fargino, Gino, ging goldige Fall, allgefall, Gedankerei. Alle Beuten, alle Teuten, alle Teigen, alle Tunden, alle Wunden, alkoholieren, all Charusen, all Uspisen, alle Knöten, alle Häuten, Gelroy und Falaschino, Palestino, Taberino, unser Univers Ladino, blonde Aladino sind. Von den Tiefen und tiefer Wochen, Slawisch, Libabisch und Terkabisch, Lachisch, Kazachisch, Japonisch und Techtonisch, Kafkadisch, Aschkenazisch, Karpatisch und Asatisch, unser Sprachgetum, unser treurigen Allgerummel, unser Rummel, unser Schummel, unser Letwisch, unser Ludwig, Jargonino, schwanker Denker, blonder Sänger, Singladino.
Those horns, by the way, those car horns are in the original recording. But yeah, that's this poem called Sing Ladino. I'm going to read it now in English translation. The translation is by my colleague at the Center, Asya Weissman-Schulman. It's fantastic translation, although, as far as comprehension goes, I'm not sure if it's any easier than the Yiddish, just by nature of the poem, but here goes. Sing Ladino, you blonde songer, are a magic jargonino, multicolored chattering, multi-tongued languaging, sundownino, fine golden radiating, bursting, multicolored thoughtingness, all the breads, all the depths, all the taigas, all the tundras, all the wonders, multicolored, multi-rhymerino, multi-gustorino, all the wicks, all the skins, yellowed and falashino, palestino, speakerino, ours, universe, ladino, you blonde aladino sing. From the depths and the still deepers, Slavic, Lubavitch, Turkovich, Polakic, Kazakic, Greekish, and Teutonic, Caucasian, Ashkenazi, Carpathian, and Asiatic, our language noiseration, our tragic multi-hyping, our bulky, our buzzing, our Latvic, our Lithuanic, Jargonino, scrawny thoughtster, you blong songer, sing Ladino. Yeah, not the easiest poem to read aloud. But I'm not going to get into an entire try to explain everything that poem's about. It would take a lot longer than we have. But just to give you a sort of a sense of the experimental nature of Glatstein's work at this time. He's making up words, he's combining words. He's on fire, really. It's amazing. This brings us now, though, to our book. Or I'm going to maybe jump forward a bit and come to the real subject of tonight, which is this book. In the summer or spring of 1934, Glatstein took a trip back to Europe to visit his dying mother, and that trip became the subject of this book. Originally, it was two novella-length works in Yiddish. The first titled Wenn Yash is gefahren, or When Yash went or traveled, and the second title, Wenn Yash is gekommen, When Yash arrived. They're translated here differently in English, which creates an interesting sort of dynamic because the narrator's name is ostensibly Yash, which was actually Glatstein's own nickname, but we don't know it or we don't hear it except in the Yiddish titles, and in the English translation we don't have the Yiddish titles, so the narrator is entirely unnamed. Nonetheless, in the first, there are really two different books. two different novellas. They were published separately, even though he took the trip in 1934, but and came back in 1934, but it took him a few years to write them. The first was published in 38, the second in 1940. Here they're published, so here in English, they comprise one book in two parts. The first one is sort of a travelogue of him, or the narrator, aboard ship on his way to Europe, describing all the people that he meets, as well as on the way from landing in France through to Warsaw. And then this is an interesting thing that he chose to do. The purpose of the trip, which was to visit his dying mother, is omitted almost entirely. We don't see it practically at all. The second part picks up after all that takes place, after his mother is presumably dead, and he's recuperating, he's just relaxing at a Jewish sort of resort hotel sanatorium type place, somewhere near or outside of Lublin, some village. And similarly to the first, he describes the people that he meets and runs into, although the crowd there is very different. These are Polish Jews of various backgrounds, rather than the really international cast of characters, most of whom are not Jewish, whom we encounter in the first half. There is also a third part, or there was supposed to be a third part, when Yash is zurückgekommen, when Yash returned, that was supposed to tell the story of the narrator returning back to America. And Glatstein never really wrote it, or he never finished it. There was a piece of it that was published in the literary journal Die Goldene Kate. I have not been able to read it, although I really would like to, because I would really like to know, what this third part might have consisted of. And I also wonder whether or not there may be fragments of this planned third installment in his papers at YIVO, where they're kept at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, which has his papers. Maybe, maybe not. Who knows? Somebody, maybe me, needs to go find that out. And there's a question, and there's all sorts of sort of speculation as to why he didn't complete it, why he never wrote that third part. We'll get back to that. But what we have here is the work as we have it is two parts, and not the third. There's a few things. I'm not going to summarize everything that happens in the book. Many of you are reading it for yourselves. If you aren't, again, I encourage you to do so. It's amazing. But I would like to just sort of point out a couple things, or offer a few thoughts. One is that it's interesting in the fact that it's a prose work to begin with. Glatstein did write some short stories earlier in his life, but he was primarily a poet. Most of his prose writing was for the newspaper. It was nonfiction. It was like literary criticism. And as far as I know, this is his only really major work of literary prose. So, after he was finished writing this, or failed to finish writing it, he went back to poetry, and he wrote a lot of poetry in the last several decades of his life. So why exactly he chose at this juncture to choose this subject and write these novellas about it in prose is an interesting question. I don't have the answer to that question, but I have to agree with him that it works. For whatever reason, he understood that in trying to tackle this subject of his return, of his voyage, of his return to Europe, of what he experienced there, that it worked as novellas. And frankly, he's right. It works great. But in viewing this, if you want to view this book as this kind of like hinge in his career, it's in the schema of things, it kind of fits nicely that it's the one work of literary prose that comes right in the middle, and is sandwiched on either side by like decades upon decades of poetry. The second thing is that even though I I characterize the turn in Glatstein's career as one from that more, exuberant experimentalism that we, heard in Zingladino to, something a little less nutty. I don't say that in a pejorative way, but later on. I think it's important to recognize that this book, as well as his later work, still has, many modernist and experimental elements. I said that it's possibly or it's arguably justified to take biographical information from this book. Okay, that's perhaps fair, but it's still true that it is not exactly an autobiography. It is not exactly a memoir. It is kind of a travelogue. It's not fully a travelogue either. He does insert all these long passages of reminiscence, of memoir. And in the midst of all this sort of genre mixing, he also has these very, sort of almost stream of consciousness, like dream descriptions, where the narrator is like in the process of falling asleep, and he describes what's going on in his dreams as like reality and dream start to mix. It's very sort of weird and experimental, and just goes to show that even though he was writing in prose rather than poetry, even though some of his earlier experimentation maybe calmed down a little bit, Glatstein was always a modernist, and he always was pushing the boundaries of form, and trying to do new things with his work. It's also, even though there's reality in here, even though there are facts there, about his life that are verifiable, it's also unclear, how much of it is in fact fictionalized. All these other characters that he meets aboard ship or in the sanitarium, were they real people? Were they composite characters? Did he make some up? Did he leave some out? Did he, all of that is possible. All that would be justified. It is not presented as a work of nonfiction, as a work of fact. It's presented as a work of fiction. So he has, ultimate license to make things up as he sees fit. But there have been efforts to sort of hunt down the real life models for some of these characters. In particular, in the second half, one of the main characters is this writer named Steinman, who's a historian trained in Germany, but he makes his living, or seems to make his living, also as a writer for the Yiddish Press, as a kind of popularizer of Hasidism and of Hasidic stories. This seems to be his thing. And in this, he's similar to real writers like, Eyal Peretz, who did that. Martin Buber in his way, although he's obviously not representing a stand-in for Martin Buber, but he's also not really standing for Peretz. Peretz died in 1915, he's much more famous, and eminent than this character seems to be. But he's so well drawn, he's so well created, it's hard to imagine, who was he? Was he really a real person? So, his name doesn't correspond. There is no such person, there's no such Yiddish literary figure named Steinman. He's not, the name does not correspond to a real person, but somebody actually went and figured this out. Monica Adamczyk Garbotska, I do not know if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, but she wrote a piece for Inge Web in which she went on this incredible journey of detective work to try to figure out who this person was. And I spoiler alerts here, but she figured out that there was in fact a real life writer named Moshe Feinberg. I never heard of him before. Probably most of us haven't, but he was a real person. Perhaps worth looking up. Glatstein certainly seemed to appreciate him. And so there are these real life correspondences in the book, but it's still ambiguous and it's still vague about what exactly they are. as to like the themes and the contents of the book, I mean, the major element that really sticks out is, of course, permanent, the rise of Nazism in Germany. This is 1934. Right in the first part, we hear about the Night of the Long Knives, which just happened then, which helps us date the action and confirm that it corresponds to the facts of Glatstein's life, his actual trip. But that was when Hitler purged the SA, the brown shirts. So these real life events, these very ominous real life events, are in and surrounding the narrative. In the first part, the narrative takes a trip by train from Paris to Warsaw, and in the process of doing that goes through Germany, where the train is boarded by a group of Hitler Youth, which is very disturbing. And then in the second part, we see really the plight of Polish Jewry. There's a long passage where, just where he recounts how person after person after person approached him and, told him their story and how they're suffering, and ultimately asked him to try to get in touch with a relative of theirs in America in the hopes that that relative would send some kind of help. So we really witnessed like the deteriorating state, really the desperate state of Polish Jewry at this time. And that is, it's hard to, it does, in a sense, it does prefigure the Holocaust. There is a passage at the beginning of the second part where one of the characters, I think it might have been Steinman, or he says parts of this that that they, meaning Polish neighbors, want to kill us. They would kill us all if they could. I mean, it's it's spooky. And that theme, the anti-Semitism, Jewish suffering, that theme became a large part of Glatstein's work, not only in this book, but also in other work that he did after his trip. So when he returned at the same time that he was writing, the first part of the Glatstein Chronicles, he also wrote what is probably his most famous poem, Good Night World. I am going to also try to play that if I can find it. I think we can skip it in Yiddish, but I will read a little bit of it in translation. This is the 1972 translation by Ruth Whitman. Good Night Wide. So this is Good Night World from 1938. Good night, wide world, big stinking world. Not you but I slam shut the gate. With a long gabardine, with a fiery yellow patch, with a proud stride. Because I want to, I'm going back to the ghetto. Wipe away, stamp out every vestige of conversion. I roll around in your garbage praise, 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 hunchback Jewish life. Damn your dirty culture, world. I wallow in your dust, even though it's forsaken, sad Jewish life. German pig, cutthroat Pole, Romania thief, land of drunkards and gluttons, weak-kneed democracy with your cold sympathy compresses. Good night, electrified, arrogant world. Back to your kerosene, candle shadows, eternal October, tiny stars. To my crooked streets, humped lanterns, my sacred pages, my Bible, my Gemara, to my backbreaking studies, to the bright Yiddish prayer book, to law, profundity, duty, justice. World, I walk gladly toward quiet ghetto light. Good night. I'll make you, world, a gift of all my liberators. Take back your Jesus Marxes, choke on their courage, croak over a drop of our Christianized blood. For I have hope, even if he is delaying, day by day my expectation rises. Green leaves will yet rustle on our sapless tree. I don't need any consolation. I'm going back to my very beginnings. From Wagner's pagan music to melody to humming, I kiss you, disheveled Jewish life. I cry with the joy of coming back. So he was writing that incredible poem at the same time as he was writing this book. So it's easy. I mean, this is a simplification, but you can see the turn. You can see from this like celebratory exuberance of an optimism of a poem like Singladino to this really fiery but very different, defiant poem like Good Night World. And then, of course, there was the Holocaust. This was published before. I mean, the second part was published in 1940 as things were beginning, but before anybody knew what was happening or what was going to happen. And I think it's fair to ask, I'm presenting this book here as a kind of turning point, this trip as a kind of turning point, but I think it's fair to ask, well, it likely wouldn't have this turning point happened anyway, right? I mean, how could any Yiddish writer, not have been affected by the Holocaust? It's inevitable, and not only the Holocaust, not only world events, but there's age. He started off as a young brash poet, and he matured into an older, more elegiac poet. That's normal too. That's also it's not necessarily contingent, upon this particular trip or this particular book. I think that turn, that change in his work may have happened anyway. I'm not necessarily claiming that this book or this trip caused it, but it does mark, so much as it marks that point. It really is a convenient kind of thing to point to, to say, all right, this is where things started to turn. And I also don't want to give the impression, though, that somehow after he came back from Europe, that things were downhill. That for him personally, I mean, things were very much downhill for the Jews of Europe. But for him personally, as far as his writing went, as far as his creativity went, as far as his career went, there was all great beforehand, and not so great after. No, in fact, like, he was extremely prolific for decades. He wrote not only poetry, he wrote prolifically in the press. He achieved definitely a renown that he didn't have before within the Yiddish world. Not as much outside of it, but certainly within it. He was a sought after speaker. He really did flourish as a writer and as a poet in the decades following. He did become an extremely powerful poet of the Holocaust. He wrote, many of his poems are just extremely beautiful in terms of their handling of what was lost, of the world that was lost. There's a poem from one of his later collections. Yes, in 1966, he published a collection called The Yid from Lublin, a Jew from Lublin, and there's a long poem in there which I'm not going to recite. It's way too long, but it's called "I Shall Remember," which is just heartbreakingly beautiful. So he was really, a powerful, creative literary figure for a long time afterwards. We're running out of time here. I do want to take questions, so I'm going to wrap it up. Just to mention that he died on November 19th, 1971. And as much as he has received a lot of recognition in amongst Yiddish writers of the 20th century, he is very well celebrated. As with many Yiddish writers, there's so much of his work that is just entirely unknown. There are poems that are still untranslated, and as I mentioned, there are just reams upon reams of literary criticism and nonfiction that he wrote for the press, and which were collected in anthologies in his lifetime, which were selected and collected, that nobody, almost nobody ever looks at. So for any enterprising Glatstein fans like myself, there's still plenty out there to discover. So thank you very much, and I will be happy to try at least to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ezra. That was great. And it is an incredibly wonderful book. I'm not biased there. So there are questions. Let's see. Were there other Yiddish writers and or actors also making the trip back to Europe then and writing about it? Were there any dialogues or programs or written accounts featuring multiple European Jews who made that trip?
Yes. Um, I'm not sure about any particular works exactly like this one, although they may exist. But there were definitely people traveling back and forth. You asked about actors. Well, of course, the Yiddish theater was an international affair. People traveled all over. They traveled between North and South, between North America and Europe. They traveled to South America. So yes, people were traveling back and forth. It wasn't a one-way journey, from Europe to the US and never to return. A lot of people did go back, if not permanently, then to visit or to perform. So what Glatstein did was not unusual. It's the book that he wrote about it that is unusual in its quality.
Someone has suggested that the poem reminds me of Joyce's use of language. Say more about the influence of Joyce.
I can't. I'm not qualified really. But that's exactly what I was trying to gesture at there. It's exactly that incredibly creative and like just form bending use of language, which is not always something that we expect to see in Yiddish poetry, but that he did exceedingly well.
And speaking of poetry, did he, I guess the question is, was he doing poetry and getting recognition for that before this book came out, or?
Yes. Yes, he was writing poetry, consistently through the 1920s and early 30s. And he was getting recognition. He wasn't famous. I don't think he was famous, like even in the sense of like other like famous Yiddish writers. Like he wasn't famous like Sholem Asch was famous at that time, for example. But he was known. If you knew it was, if you were in the know, if you read Yiddish poetry, then you would know about him. Then you would know that he was the real deal.
There are two versions of, and excuse my pronunciation, Wenn Yash is Geforn in the Yiddish, in the Center's digital Yiddish library. Do you know anything about the changes in the second edition that came out in Argentina?
A very interesting question. I don't. I wouldn't expect that there are changes, but you never know. I mean, it's something to investigate.
Do you know, sorry, I have a terrible mosquito here. Do you know if his writing for Yiddish films, he's credited as Jacob Glatstein for the Wilner Shot Kazan, sorry again, 1940, dwelling on Polish Jewish life and a century earlier. I think he was hired for dialogue scripting.
That is fascinating.
Questions. Yeah.
Yeah, that is fascinating, and not really something that I know about. But if anybody knows more, I would love to hear about it.
It's very interesting prompting of discussion.
Yeah.
Did he write in English at all?
That's an interesting question. I'm not aware. I'm not aware. I mean, he was fluent in English. He talks about being fluent in English in this book. He had to be. I'm not aware of him writing in English, but again, not impossible. Some of his work was translated in his lifetime into English, as well as other languages and published. I don't know. It'd be interesting to know if he had a hand in those translations. They aren't credited to him, at least not the ones that I'm familiar with. But who knows?
Actually, the rhythm of the first poem reminded me of the Kaddish. Did he in fact use the rhythm of prayer?
That's an interesting observation. It wasn't one that occurred to me, but now until you pointed it out. He definitely seems to like that kind of those repetitive syllables and repetitive sounds that do sound kind of like the Kaddish. And he like I mentioned, he had a very thorough religious education, and you can see that influence throughout his work, throughout his life. He's very comfortable with religious vocabulary, and there's a whole, I'm sure there's a whole paper to be written about his relation to religion and to orthodoxy. There's a scene in this book where he's sitting in with some Hasidic folks at the sanitarium and realizes after the fact that he wasn't wearing a yarmulke and feels bad about it. but yeah, so if in fact that's it sounds like the cottage, then yeah, there's reasons for it.
Do you think it's because the work was fictionalized, the characters on the boat were used as a way to represent different Jews at that time? I guess different Jewish experience maybe is what the question is. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, both in terms of different Jewish experience, the Jews on the boat and non-Jews, like, it is a literary work. It's a very good literary work. And I can't imagine that he just sort of took, whatever happened to be there, and used it without calculating, how it would function in the book. So even if there is, a factual basis for a lot of it, it's arranged very carefully, I think. I think that's correct.
Do you have a link to the Yiddish text of the poem that we just heard?
When
Glatstein recited is what they've asked.
Oh, the recitation?
Yeah.
Yes, I can. I'm not really equipped to share it right now, but we can maybe post it when the video goes up. Or you can just, you can search on our website under his name and you can find all the recordings. This one is simply called Jacob Glatstein Lent, Jacob Glatstein Reads, and there's a whole long list of poems that he's reciting. And according to the info here, it took place on January 1st, 1955.
So just hop on the Yiddish Book Center's website, use the search button, and you should find your way to that and others. And I guess we could make this the last question. Where is the book available in English? Do you want me to answer that one?
I'm sorry?
Where's the book available in English?
Yes, Lisa, take it away.
Okay, at shop.yiddishbookcenter.org and at fine bookstores wherever you shop. And it's the Glatstein Chronicles, reissued by White Press. Ezra, huge thanks for this. All of the book club readers out there, we hope you're enjoying the book, and check out the website where you'll learn about Great Jewish Books Club, and also you'll find all sorts of information about the book. Thanks again, Ezra.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Thanks to our producers this evening, Elizabeth Carteropoli and Jeff Hayes, truly great colleagues who pulled this off. Tonight's program is presented as part of the Yiddish Book Center's 2023 Great Jewish Books Club, and as part of an ongoing series of public programs brought to you live, as I like to say, from the Yiddish Book Center. We hope that you'll join us Thursday, June 15th at 7 p.m. for Women in Exile, What Yenta Mosh Can Tell Us with Ellen Cassidy, and on Thursday, June 29th at 7 p.m. for Kibbutz and Nosh, Cafeteria Culture in the 1970s New York City with Marcia Richter Halpern and Deborah Dash Moore. And I would be remiss if I didn't remind you to nab your tickets for Yidstock, July 13th through 16th, live at the Yiddish Book Center. Concert passes have already sold out, so you're out of luck there. But individual concerts tickets are available, but I would caution you that those are almost sold out as well. yiddishbookcenter.org/events to learn more about all of our programming. I want to take a moment to thank all of our members out there who make all of our ongoing work possible. Please learn how you can support our work by visiting yiddishbookcenter.org/donate. Thanks for joining us this evening. Look forward to welcoming you back to our theater on Thursday, June 15th. Till then, stay well, stay happy, and see you soon.